Neighborhoods. We have secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks. We host about 75 programs per year, believe it or not. That's a lot of programs. Most of these programs are free, and we love doing it, and we thank you all for being dedicated program goers and supporters of ours. We look at the role of everything from local small businesses to independent cultural institutions, civil rights and social justice movements, great artists, writers, musicals, as well as irreplaceable and unique built environment of our neighborhoods in our mission and our scope. We are a membership-based organization, so why I'm here tonight, partially, but also I really want to hear from Professor Kennedy. We rely upon you to support us. So we thank you very much for being here, and we're so grateful to you for everything that you do for village preservation, both financially, but also importantly, coming to programs, coming to rallies, and being a part of our community, which is so deeply special to us, and I think to you too. So if you need to learn more about us, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but if you need to learn more about us, please go to our website, villagepreservation.org, and please do consider becoming a member if you're not already, or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. Now, for my favorite part, Jeffrey Kennedy is an associate professor of interdisciplinary arts and performance at Arizona State University. He's author of numerous journal articles and book chapters on American theater history, with a strong focus on Eugene O'Neill, Susan Glaspell, and the Provincetown Players. And I am thrilled to have Professor Kennedy here with us tonight, so please do welcome him.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're here, and it's so fun to be back in the village. I lived here for all the years I was a PhD student at NYU and part of the educational theater program, and I'll tell a little bit of that story and how I became connected with the Provincetown Players in that process. I've written some things. Now, first of all, Lynn, this is yours, so thank you. Here's the book, and I wanted you to see why I had to choose what we're going to talk about today. Because this is the best book stop in the world, and it's the tome, if you will, and it took quite some time to write. But the exciting thing, the last book written on the Provincetown Players, in terms of their full history, was written all the way back in 1982. And prior to that was in 1931. So as much as there have been biographies on O'Neill and others that were associated, but in terms of the history of the Players, even just the 7 years that they existed, and that's all they existed, people don't realize, those 7 years, they had 90 plus plays by 47 different playwrights, just in those 7 years. So that's a lot of history, and I decided to leave no stone unturned. Plus, in 1982, when Dr. Sarlos wrote his book, there was no internet. So I have benefited from the development of that. Hi, David, I'm so glad to see you. And also how archives have also digitized in such an incredible way. The incredible archivists all over the country that have helped me in this. I think we finally figured out that I'd been to something like 75 different libraries within the country, because so many people, they might have been here for a time, but their papers or their lives ended up in other parts of the country. And so that's been terribly exciting to uncover and to just find out how much, and some of my friends would say I left truly no stone unturned. And so I want to read a little bit from my introduction first, but Maya, if you don't mind, is that comfortable for you to, okay, if you could advance the slide, I do want to show what's on the cover of the book. This is a story within itself, and this is why I have to stick to the script, because I have so many stories. And you don't, if I go off, we're just never going to get to anything substantial, okay? And so, but they're very fun. This has been missing for 60 years. It was painted by Charles Ellis, who was a part of the Provincetown Players. He ended up marrying Norma Millay, Edna St. Vincent Millay's sister, who was also very much a part of the Players. And for many, many years, they lived up in Austerlitz at Steeple Top, where Edna lived and built quite an amazing place. And then they've turned it into a colony of sorts for artists to come and work. And they both passed at the early 2000s, late 1990s. And but I have a black and white photo that someone made, who knows how long ago of this, but that's it. And I've asked everyone, where is this painting? It can't be black and white, first of all. Where is it? And so, like you do, when you're in the midst of writing something, you get hold of anybody you can. So I wrote the Edna St. Vincent Millay Society, who are housed in Austerlitz, and I just wrote a little email. I didn't really know anybody then, but I had just taped for PBS, for Poetry in America. I'd been a scholar on them talking about Edna St. Vincent Millay. And so I got to tell these juicy stories about, because Millay was a piece of work. And especially here in the village, my favorite is I guess I got the first PG rating for Poetry in America with this story, but she showed up to meet one of her gentlemen, and she says, I'm really tired, I've already had 2 of these today. And so she got around, that Edna, and Norma, on the other hand, and Charles met each other, and there was no one else in their lives but the 2 of them forever. So I wrote up there, and I said, hey, I'm just wondering, I know that most of Charles Ellis's materials are at the Smithsonian, but is there any way that you might have something on Ellis that I just don't know about? And so one of their volunteer office people wrote back, and I saw there was an attachment that said, actually, no, most of Ellis's stuff is at the Smithsonian, but have you ever seen this? And sent me a JPEG of this that he'd taken with his phone. And I said, not wanting to, you don't want to act too excited too quickly. And so I said, well, where is that? And he wrote back and said, oh, it's sitting on the floor next to my desk. It's been there for a number of years. Well, because thankfully the Millay folks loved the Poetry in America episode, yay for serendipity, and they granted me the permission to use this as the cover of my book. And what this is called At Christine's, because upstairs on the 2nd floor of both of their playhouses, and some of you may not know that they started not at 133 McDougal, but at 139 McDougal, 3 doors down. And upstairs, they always had a little restaurant. One of George Cram Cook's biggest things was he wanted a place for fellowship for everybody after rehearsals and after shows, just to blow off steam. And so Christine there is in the very back. That's George Cram Cook. She has her arm over his shoulder. This is James Light. This is Eugene O'Neill. And this is Eugene O'Neill's boyhood friend, who was a journalist and also became part of the Players for a time, Hutchinson Collins. And they're all sitting up. And I always love to say it's after Prohibition, because there's a bottle there. And they are at Christine's. And so I'm terribly excited that ended up on the cover of my book. It's been that kind of a journey. Surprise after surprise after surprise. And so the way I got into it, I'm going to read you just a little bit from the introduction to my book, because it's easier to keep me on track, okay? Late 20th century theater scholar Mary C. Henderson declared that the Provincetown Players left a legacy unparalleled in the history of American theater. While she's not alone in that estimation, she also points to some of the complications that tracing their legacy has created for historians. In quotes, largely as a result of Eugene O'Neill's association with it, she writes, the Provincetown group over the years became suffused with mystique and legend. In the published memoirs of some of the founders, there is frequent disagreement. She's not wrong about that. As an example, she notes, some recall the activities as ablaze with rebellion and political radicalism. Others thought of them as just so much recreation. Within these few sentences, one can see the challenges of attempting to document the history of the Provincetown Players. Certain events, such as how Eugene O'Neill was discovered, why the original Players came to Provincetown, and the real reason why the Players ended after 7 years, have succumbed to the embellishing of a good story in its retelling for dramatic purposes. Unfortunately, despite the mystique this creates, many accounts, even those in recent publications, have ignored contrary evidence or glaring inconsistencies and chosen instead to repeat the legends without further investigation. As Henderson infers, the differing memories of those who were there have led many scholar historians to feel they must choose from among these accounts. She goes on to both identify an often stated conclusion and then propose an alternative. O'Neill remains the crowning achievement of the Provincetown Players, she says, but as his friend and associate Kenneth McGowan has pointed out, they found in their justification outside of O'Neill in the creative spirit which the playhouse breathed on all who came within it. Applauding how their work spread beyond their home on McDougal Street, Henderson writes, for all of the little theaters that came after it, both in New York and abroad in the land, it represented and continues to represent the apogee of what can be achieved by an inspired band of amateurs. You can go ahead, I think, and do another slide there. 70 years after McGowan's statement, American cultural critic Robin M. Crundon proposed, the summer of 1916, when the Players solidified their existence, may well have been the most important few weeks in the history of the American theater. And certainly remains exceptional even in the much broader perspective of American modernism. In 2023, Todd Lincoln, the artistic director of New Dramatists, wrote that the Players were, in his words, the birth of an experimental art theater upon whose foundations so many of our later companies would stand, end quote. Theater scholar C.W.E. Bixby proposed that on November 2nd, 1916, O'Neill's play Bounties for Cardiff opened not only the first New York season of the Provincetown Players, but also the history of 20th century American drama. Many scholars like these have concurred and unequivocally affirmed the Provincetown Players' monumental importance to American theater. Perhaps the figure who has drawn the most diverse scrutiny and about whom there has been the most disagreement in the play is the Players' leader and founder, George Cram Cook. He is a complex figure, to be sure, yet his presence is seminal in every aspect of the Players. Partial view of the man and incomplete accounts of his influences often obscure his part in the Players' artistic and organizational decisions. One of the major items that my book investigates is George Cram Cook's legacy as the leader of the Provincetown Players and why. After a successful and significant career in other arenas, particularly as a writer and a critic, he would take on the creation and development. Why would he take on the creation and development of an experimental theater company? After years of researching and writing about the Players' work, I was compelled to find out what motivated Cook and what he saw as the potential outcome of starting a theater collective. How could it be worth the sacrifice? I wondered how Cook made his goals seem so significant that he could spark within some of the most radical minds and successful writers and artists in America the desire to create an amateur theater with no financial payoff in sight. There was a time when they were all up in Provincetown in 1916 that someone wrote, "I'm sitting here amongst the best minds in America." And they were both the most radical minds in America politically in some ways, but also they were the great writers and journalists of the time all together. And they were there for vacation. None of this was supposed to happen. This was vacation time up in Provincetown. Back then, it didn't cost what it costs now to stay there. It was a Portuguese fishing village, and that's what was so attractive, was because people could go and it was so cheap. And you could really enjoy. And very early on, by 1899, Charles Hawthorne had started teaching plein air, which meant outside, plein air painting. And so very quickly it started to become an art colony. And other artists started to come, and then others started teaching as well. And eventually it became a place where Mary Heaton Vorse went first. The minute she got there, her stepbrother lived there by this time. She got there and said, "Oh, this is home. This is where I want to be." And so she moved there and watched any of you that know the huge tower in Provincetown that you see when you first come in, that was built in 1910, dedicated by Taft, and who came there, and what it commemorates is that Provincetown was the first place the Pilgrims stopped, not Plymouth Rock. And so she was there while they were building that, and slowly began to invite friends to come and vacate from the city and from the village in the summers. And many did and loved it. So, what was it about that time in America's cultural and political life and in the bohemian freedom pursued in New York City's Greenwich Village that would make it the perfect incubator for a little theater like the Provincetown Players to have an impact? I also wanted to know what in the trajectory of Cook's life prepared him to take on the unlikely task of starting a theatrical venture in his 40s when he had not been more than a spectator to theater at that point. What I discovered was that Cook's primary motivation was a strong sense of what I have named cultural patriotism, spurred on by his desire to see on stage a more realistic depiction of modern life in America than had yet been portrayed. He wanted the American cultural identity and syntax that had begun in the modernist writings of the Chicago literary Renaissance to be front and center in America's theaters. With his love of and scholarly knowledge of ancient Greek culture, he hoped to create a community that wedded theater to the society as closely as he perceived ancient Athens had been able to achieve. He became convinced of the need for American playwrights to write new plays in the modern style, and he felt that he could knowledgeably inspire them to do so. Born of a desire to create an environment to improve himself, the entire through line of Cook's work and career had been teaching, encouraging, and inspiring writers. What my research revealed is that his career began by creating open spaces for writers in America to develop their work, even as a student conceiving and implementing the first creative writing club at the University of Iowa. After a year's study then at Harvard followed, he returned to Iowa to teach its first course in creative writing, using a unique workshop style, which means the students would bring in their work and they'd read them to each other and they'd evaluate each other's work. And that became the genesis of what is now known as the Iowa Writers Workshop, arguably still the most esteemed academic program in the country for creative writers. Cook soon tried his hand at writing novels and was successful in the pre-20th century, more romantic style. He earned a literary legacy as the assistant editor of the Friday Literary Review, a supplement of the Chicago Evening Post. Through his criticism, he taught Americans what was and was not the best of the new realistic modernism in literature and why. However, what initially ignited the deeper calling that resulted in the Players came from experiencing a performance of the Irish Players when they were on tour in Chicago in 1913. This controversial theater company, I say that because everywhere they had been on their tour before Chicago, including New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, there had been riots because they were doing a play called Playboy of the Western World, right? And the Irish, of course, there were huge amounts of Irish. Of course, probably some of you, I'm a Kennedy, so, all of us, they took such umbrage to the idea, even in a comedic sense, that anyone would ever boast about killing their father, which is what happens in the play. And so, without even seeing the productions, there were riots in each place. And so Chicago was so scared. And the only reason Cook was there was someone in the company that was a friend. And they enlisted some of the theater people in Chicago at the time to kind of be a posse inside the theater in case something happened. Thankfully, nothing did. And in fact, because they had told people, listen, just don't come if you don't think you're going to like it. Instead, they got rave reviews in all of the editions of the papers. So once he saw this in 1913, this controversial theater company had found an organic way to communicate true Irishness through its playwriting and acting styles, displaying on stage the depth of their country's poetic soul, wrapped in the simplicity of its human character. Cook knew immediately that this is what he wanted for America. Unshackling the British influence prevalent in plays performed professionally and capturing his own country's unique identity in the immediacy and emotional spectrum that the stage could provide. He also knew that this meant finding American playwrights with modern literary sensibilities that would be able to write this kind of theater, and he was acutely aware that not many yet existed. By observing other small theater groups as they formed in Chicago and Greenwich Village, Cook found that none of them were willing to commit exclusively to developing new American playwrights. For him, the vacuum this created called him to be filled. Finally, in the familiar atmosphere created by the writers and artists that had begun to vacation together in Provincetown on Cape Cod, and in the confidence and bliss of his new marriage to celebrated writer Susan Glaspell, Cook seized on a moment that he'd been waiting to recognize. And in the summer of 1915, the Provincetown Players were born. Unfortunately, Cook used ill-chosen words at the end of the Players' 7 years to describe their end as a failure. And therefore, by association, many scholars have used his own words against him and labeled him a failure as well. Like most people, Cook made mistakes, and he had vices that affected him. But I believe that his legacy, as well as the Players, is anything but a failure. Perhaps their most significant success is how deeply they influenced American theater, who contributed to his vision and who fought against it, as well as the history of those who became, within the work of the Provincetown Players, as Henderson had said, the apogee of what can be achieved by an inspired band of amateurs. So let's move that ahead, and that should show us, so let me tell you a little bit about my story in connecting to the Provincetown Players. I first became aware of the Provincetown Players during my graduate studies in educational theater at New York University. I became a teaching fellow in the program in 1996, and by the end of that first semester, the university, who owned the Playhouse's building. Now, my next book is on the building. My next book is from 1922 till today, and what happened inside that theater. So I got all kinds of fun things to say about that. And it turns out, here's a little preview nobody knows, NYU owned that building since 1984. 3 law students bought it and sold it to the company for $1. And so while Vampire Lesbians of Sodom was going on there for 4 years, their longest running play, NYU owned it. So there's lots of fun stuff to tell down the road. Okay, that's the next book. But I became a teaching fellow, as I said, and by the end of that first semester, the university, who owned the Playhouse's building, informed us that they were initiating a refurbishment of the theater so that our program might use it to produce plays, offer community programs, and teach courses in theater. Our program chair, who was also an O'Neill scholar, Dr. Lowell Swartzell, asked if I could write a short history of the Playhouse for our next program newsletter, which I did. I'd taken his O'Neill class, but that's as much as I'd done. But the more I looked into it, I found so much information that interested me that it quickly became 2 newsletter articles over a period of time, and I was soon a member of a team charged with creating a small historical gallery inside the refurbished Playhouse. Thus, in 1997, I began my journey of researching the Provincetown Playhouse and its first resident company, the Provincetown Players, who created the original theater at 133 McDougal Street in 1918. Let's see, I go here. During the summer of 1997, I could be found many days inside the Playhouse as construction began. I observed the spine of the building. That's what these pictures are from. This was when they took everything down, and I got to see the 1850 walls because it was a row house there. All those are all connected from 131 all the way to 139, right? And so I got to see all this stuff. And the workers just kept looking at me like, what is the matter with you? I'm taking pictures, I'm doing all this stuff. But I observed the spine of the building's original structure from the 1850s, gathered old playbills caught in the slats of the floor as it was dismantled, and preserved multiple thick layers of paint that had been added to the walls over 80 years. I still possess those today. It's that thick, okay? Big chunks. I said, those are mine. I'm keeping those. As I worked with NYU archivist Nancy Kricko, we realized that so much was needed to adequately tell the player's story. She suggested I write a short monograph, so we began creating this as well. In the process, I met many influential theater artists who felt a deep connection to the Playhouse. One example, the day after the grand reopening of the Playhouse in May 1998, I attended an event at which playwright Edward Albee was part of a panel. And in a chance meeting afterwards, I gave him a copy of the new monograph. And I will tell you how chance it was. I was running to the subway, and the train had just left, but here was Albee standing there, who had just been a speaker at it, and he came right up to me, saw that I'd been at the thing with the program it was at 92nd Street Y, and he said, so what was Kushner talking about? It was Tony Kushner and John Robbie Bates also in the panel. What was Kushner talking about at the Provincetown Playhouse? That was his opening line to me. I don't know the man for anything, right? And so I said, well, I happen to have a monograph here. And we ended up talking for 2 hours. It was heaven, right? Because, some of you may know, he was shocked to hear the Playhouse had reopened and thrilled that we commemorated his play, The Zoo Story, which premiered there in January 1960. That summer, a theater company led by Stephen Kennedy Murphy performed a series of early O'Neill one-act plays in the Playhouse. Every night for weeks, I heard O'Neill's words ring against the same walls where they were first spoken. Amazing. That same summer of 1998, Dr. Swartzell and I founded and co-produced the Sense Award-winning New Plays for Young Audiences play reading series, attempting to revive and emulate the purpose and spirit for which the Playhouse was initially created. Now, over 2 decades later, I'm pleased to say this series continues. And then I did all kinds of crazy things. I gave tours for the Museum of the City of New York. I gave tours for the New York Historical Society and many different Greenwich Village associations. I wrote a 2-volume history of the Playhouse as my dissertation. Subsequently created the research website provincetownplayhouse.com. Have spoken at conferences all over the world about the Players, served a term as the president of the Eugene O'Neill International Society, hosted the Society's International Conference in the Playhouse, and have published many chapters in journals about the Playhouse's history prior to my volume, Staging America. As you can see, this theater and its ghosts have been an intimate part of my life for some time now. Let's move it ahead, and we'll move into Provincetown. I love keeping it crooked because you just can't do that on purpose, you know what I mean? That is the original photo for some reason. The Provincetown Players began when a group of writers and artists who were vacationing in Provincetown, Massachusetts, presented their plays on July 15, 1915, on the veranda of Hutchin Hapgood's and Neath Boyce's rented Ocean View cottage. The 2 plays performed were Constancy, by Neath Boyce, a thinly veiled play about the recent relationship between Mabel Dodge and John Reed, 2 names you may have heard of from the village before, and Suppressed Desires, a satire of Freudian dream interpretation, all the rage in the village at the time. Susan Glaspell used to say you couldn't go buy a bun without somebody talking about Freud dream interpretations and them interpreting what you were buying. So I guess that's how much it was, right? And that was written by husband and wife George Cram Cook and Susan Glaspell. Boyce had previously had a reading of her play, and she doesn't get as much credit as she deserves. Really, the idea for even doing these plays was hers. She wanted to be a playwright. She was already a great writer. Because her name Neath, many people didn't know it was a woman, and if you read reviews of her books, they say he a lot. The pronouns are wrong, and it's very fascinating. Well, she really wanted to write plays, and so she had taken this play, and it was really quite recently written, and so they had a reading at her play a few weeks prior, and this caused Cook and Glaspell to add their play to the evening and create a social event for their friends. It was about 30 people, that's all. That's all they could fit in this room. And 2 makeshift sets, one facing the ocean and one facing the living room, were quickly organized by Robert Edmund Jones, who was vacationing in Provincetown and was the most prominent American practicing the new stagecraft. At the time, the use of more abstract environments by breaking up the two-dimensionality of a space. It was completely new, based on Edward Craig's ideas from England and all of that. And nobody else was doing it here except Jones. Well, he just happened to be on vacation. There's a lot of just happened to be's, by the way, in this story. It's so cool, right? But so he was there, and so he just made up these 2 things, and he literally told the audience, okay, now get up and move, and then they faced the living room. So the first play, they were facing the ocean, and the second play, they were facing the living room. He moved some things around, and that was the 2 sets for the opening night. Well, many friends and neighbors not in attendance that night heard about the plays, and I didn't write this down, they were pissed off they weren't invited. And it was very close community there, right? And so they wanted to see them. So they were presented in a makeshift theater on a wharf. Let's show them another picture of this. Just purchased by writer Mary Heaton Horse. Now this is actually a very newly found photo because nobody ever took a picture from the ocean. But it was taken by the famous painter Wharton in Provincetown, and Wharf, and many people say to me, why would she want to buy an old pier, right? Why would she want a wharf? Well, guess what came with it? That house, which had been a chandlery. Many of you know that means that's a place where you buy equipment for boats and for fishing, and it was huge. And that came, so it was the house she wanted, not the wharf. The wharf came with it, okay? So that, I was always like, why the hell would they want the wharf? Well, it was because she wanted the house, and the whole thing came with it. Now, you'll hear in a moment, you'll see another picture about why that looks like it does. There's less of it there by the time we get that picture. Their popularity from doing just that in the living room was such that, led by George Cram Cook, 2 more plays were presented that summer, with amateur acting by artists Charles DeMuth, B.J.O. Nordfeldt, and Cook. That fall and winter in Greenwich Village, where most of the group lived and worked, Cook stirred up enthusiasm such that an even greater number of artists and writers made their way to Provincetown the next summer. He was drumming up business. And these new participants included journalist and poet John Reed, writer Louise Bryant, painter Marsden Hartley, artists William and Marguerite Zorak, the famed hobo poet Harry Kemp, editor of the revolutionary magazine The Masses, Max Eastman, his wife, lawyer and activist Ida Rao, Floyd Dell, and a new young playwright named Eugene O'Neill. Now, despite a mythology that present O'Neill just happening to show up in Provincetown with a trunk full of plays, which many of the accounts tell, and Glaspell was one of those, weirdly, research proves that O'Neill knew of the players in advance, came to the Cape specifically, I can almost say it, to participate with them. In fact, he was directly invited by John Reed. Though the group initially rejected some of O'Neill's plays, and nobody tells you that either, but they didn't like some of his early plays. They just hated them, in fact, which had been self-published with the help of his father, prominent American actor James O'Neill, famous for The Count of Monte Cristo and his versions of that. He finally read for them his play that his teacher at Harvard had said was not a play, and it was called Bounties for Cardiff. A play set at sea. Glaspell later wrote that when they heard this play, the group knew what they were for. The play's plot is simple. A sailor lies dying and talks to his longtime mate as the continued regimen of sailing a ship in a storm goes on all around them. The play's dialogue featured crude yet poetic sailor talk, possessing a new reality that had yet to be part of the theater's new realism. Added to the play's presentation was the highly effective sense of reality given by the wharf theater over the sea. With fog that night and the sound of waves surrounding the audience beating themselves against the bottoms right here. This is low tide, but it was high tide with a storm and fog coming in the night of Bound East. Though already a recognized author, Glaspell began her career as a playwright that summer after her husband announced she was writing a play, though he had yet to inform her. The result was Trifles, well, still one of the most celebrated one-act plays in the American canon. It is based on the journalistic investigation that Glaspell made as a newspaper woman in Iowa of the murder of a husband by a quiet prairie woman. The play is unique in that the main character, the woman, is never present, and also because the wives of the investigators, who are dismissed and ignored by their husbands in the process, begin to recognize clues and signs of abuse within the woman's home and figure out why she has murdered her husband. In the end, the women choose, in solidarity with her plight, to keep those facts to themselves. By the end of the summer, after some minor so now we're going to look at pictures. Let's look at a few things, Maya. So after this, now, can you believe this? They worked 2 summers to get this thing into great shape, new curtain, the whole thing, and 1 week before they opened for that summer, it caught on fire. The woman working with the costumes, and they also had an art school that was using the upstairs. She was drawing some things a little too close to the fire. There was kiln kind of a fire in there. And the one thing you don't want to hear in Provincetown, with those slat wood homes right next to each other, is the word fire, especially if it's being screamed, right? But that's exactly what happened. Now, many folks don't know, but Glaspell and Cook lived across the street. So he was the first there. Luckily, there was a fire pump wagon not far down the street, and so it was there pretty quick. So if you take a look, that is a hose coming all the way from the street. You see them holding it and throwing down. See this building? That's not in any of the pictures. There's a reason it burned down. It was a storage building that had been part of the whaling company that initially owned this wharf. And so it burned down. So you'll notice in the pictures, even the one we just looked at, that doesn't exist. Well, can you imagine? That was also the summer there were dead fish all over the place on the beach for some reason. So dead fish smell. Now they've got a burned curtain and 1 full wall charred, and they're going to open a theater season. Right? So it must have been a very sensual kind of an experience for them. But that's how that worked. Let's see a few more here. If you can believe this, we have 2 or 3 pictures on that wharf of some of the plays. This is a Bound East for Cardiff. You'll recognize that the same set will be in the version that we do in the Provincetown Playhouse. Right? But here is the whole gang. Here's John Reed, one of the minor characters. Here's George Cram Cook playing Yank, the lead character who's been hurt and is dying. Let's see another one. I think there's another. Oh yes, this is one you want to see. O'Neill hated acting. Hated it. And he became the 2nd officer because that's the smallest part in this play. And he was standing off the side, and they said he was breathing so hard in nervousness you could hear it on stage, right, which made people crazy. But there's another great story. At one point, George Cram Cook, Harry forgets a whole section and just jumps ahead. And Cook, who's supposedly dying, leans up and goes, "Damn you, Harry," in the middle of the play. So, I mean, it was all, there was nothing professional going on here, okay? But O'Neill finally came and we've got this picture of him in his rain slicker, looking like the 2nd officer, which is amazing. Let's see some more. When I say that they really were a family and became one, it truly was. I got many more pictures, but this is one I like because of how many people are here. This is Susan Glaspell, Beatrix Hapgood, Mary Heaton Vorst, Hippolyte Havel was. I mean, they had everyone. He was an archivist, it was anarchist, and this guy was. The whole gang from the village was there. And you notice they're not dressed for the beach well, in terms of that. Here is Harry Weinberger, their longtime lawyer. Hutchins Hapgood is here, Miriam, their daughter. So that's just one of the pictures. We'll look at the next one because they both have O'Neill in them. Here's O'Neill and Charles DeMuth. Now O'Neill was a swimmer. He'd scare everybody because he could swim miles. And so he would get to where you couldn't see him anymore, and people were like, he's gone, he's not coming back. But he always would. And then here he is with the man who invited him, John Reed. So yes, let's move ahead. We'll look at some productions. This is a great photo. This is also, again, this is just the back. Now, one of the fun things, you'll see it in a moment, is that, a wharf, it was for fishing, right? And so there was always a sliding door at the back so that they could load the fish into the wharf, right? Or lower things into the water. And so they'd have to cover certain things. O'Neill didn't like anything expressionistic, anything that wasn't realistic. So this had to look to him like a real wharf, because this play, Thirst, not one of his best, but nonetheless, it was Titanic was 1912. So he wrote 3 shipwreck plays, because that was, as a young playwright, it was in his head. Well, this one it's now in the middle of summer and they're shipwrecked. And they're out in the middle. So it's the opposite of the Titanic, right? And so he played the mulatto guy from one of the crew members who ended up in this raft. And he's kind of hungry and suggests that maybe Louise Bryant here would be good lunch. Well, that didn't go over too well with George Cram Cook as the rich businessman. It's quite a fascinating play, but the end of the play is there's nobody left in the raft. And so it gives a very eerie feeling, if nothing else, by the time it's done. Then this is where you can see that door open. Here's Provincetown Bay, right? Here is even, you'll see in a moment, the backdrop for the game. This is storage, folks. They got to put it somewhere, and it's this big old backdrop. So I finally realized that that's what that was, hanging up there all rolled up. And Enemies was an interesting play, the first of its kind, the first maybe autobiographical play in America, because Neath and Hutchins famously had one of the most contentious marriages of all time. And yet they were determined to work it out. But Hutch, in like many of the early men in the village in the modern era, felt that open marriage and free love was something he wanted to explore, but he didn't want his wife to have that same privilege. And so it was a constant battle, right? Because he finally said fine, and then of course she fell in love with his best friend, over in Europe. And so, and his response was actually almost violent at times. And so these very famous writers just kept like this all the time. So they wrote a play called Enemies, and literally they would write their section and hand the script to each other to next continue the dialogue between them. And it's really a fascinating play, and feminists have actually taken this on because Neath was always very resolute, at least in her thinking. At the same time, she loved Hutch, and they had children that they loved also very, very much, and had been through a lot together. Well, Hutch was far from an actor, as you can see, with his script in hand here. He just couldn't do it otherwise. So they staged this play, kind of as an experiment at the end before they all went home to the village in the summer of '16. But I love that you get to see that there's the door open in the back, and you see it really was out there in the wild, folks. It just was. So, let's see what I have next. I think, yes, perfect. I promise we're going to save up the questions, okay? We're going to have time to ask questions before we're done. By the end of that summer, after some minor recognition in the Boston papers, the group decided to form an official organization with a constitution, and an initial process for working was agreed upon. The group's primary purpose was to give venue to American playwrights and new American plays, purposefully encouraging plays that would be in contrast to the melodramas and the love triangle plays that they observed producers were presenting on Broadway. In doing so, the group quickly gave larger voice to the burgeoning Little Theater movement taking place across the country. Initially led by George Cram Cook and John Reed, the Provincetown Players moved to New York that fall of 1916 and turned the first floor parlor apartment at 139 McDougal Street, an 1840s brownstone row house, into a theater. The building was located in the heart of the village at the time, next door to the Liberal Club and Polly Holliday's restaurant. Fascinating, just this little side note, everybody had, because a gentleman wrote his dissertation on the Liberal Club, he put the wrong address in that dissertation for where the Liberal Club was, and so everyone has repeated that, and it was wrong. And so we now realize that where the Washington Square bookshop was, which had an open door to the Liberal Club, they did that because they thought, oh, we'll sell more books. Instead, people just borrowed them and returned them. And so it was swapped. And the way we found out is that when Polly Holliday moved her restaurant site, the Dutch Oven took their place, and I have all their ads for the Dutch Oven, and it was at 137, not 135 McDougal Street. So all of a sudden, we're like, wait, what's going on? Well, it turned out the Liberal Club was closer to 139, and that, in fact, the Washington Square Bookshop was at 135. Here's the stuff you find out. Literally, this is why being right is so important, because all these decades later, people would just assume, well, this is a guy doing his PhD. And much of his information is amazing, but it was wrong. So that's a big deal. Just off the southwest corner, as you all know, of Washington Square. The group constructed, listen to this, and think about how small this is. A 10½ by 14-foot stage. Folks, think about that again. You don't even want to be buried in something that small. Do you know what I'm saying? Much less call it a stage. And added wooden benches to seat an audience of about 140. The benches were said to be the most uncomfortable in the entire world. Okay? There's another wonderful village shot of Washington Square in 1926. Let's see if the Playhouse is there. Well, so here they are setting up for Bounties. Notice it's the same set design, but now here's a parlor ceiling in 139. So they're having to cover it. This is the most staged thing of all, because you would never want the most often drunk O'Neill on a ladder. And that's why someone's holding him up behind, right? And here's Cook with a dowel just in case, right? All of it's a staged thing, but they were preparing the set and this parlor apartment that they literally transformed into a stage. Let's see I don't want to get too ahead of myself. There is that backdrop that I told you about for the game, and didn't like that. Let's come back. Well, I'll talk a little bit. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Now, I wanted to show you in sequence then, the next slide, is that the backdrop, Marguerite Zorak designed that and painted it. Her her daughter, who is still alive at 99 in Maine, tells me that it was bright colors, because they loved that at the time. And it kind of had an Egyptian feel to it in what they did. And then their father, William Zorak, both of these, by the way, were so renowned they were in the Armory Show in 1913. As American artists, there weren't too many. And so he cut this out as a wood cut, right? And they used this as the moniker for the Provincetown Players. Now, to prove it, here's John Reed's in his office, and here's the poster with the moniker on it. So it gives you a chance to see, they were like, this is too good, we're not wasting this. And so they continue that. Now, I think I get to show them the Playhouse now. This is my most cherished photo, because there is no other photo of 139 where you can see those uncomfortable seats, right? And notice you can only come in from the right side. Now, the more I've looked at it, the more I'm convinced this is backwards, but I've not been played with it, okay, too much, because this is how it came to me. Look at all that number of people on a 10 by 14 stage, and the layers that these fabulous modern artists have created of art behind them. Those are bright colors, right? And this is David Pinsky, the famous Yiddish playwright. And this, I'll tell you about her in just a moment. And the crazy part about this, I'm pretty convinced this is Glassable watching, because she had a hat just like that, it looks like her. Those guys were invited, they didn't know from a theater company, they were invited to rehearsals. And in fact, people would talk up in the middle of rehearsals. At one point, there was a scene where somebody had to kiss somebody, and the guy was a little reticent, and somebody from the back says, "Kiss her, for God's sake!" You know, I mean, this was the kind of looseness that they allowed, because they were really fashioning themselves government-wise after the masses, which was completely together, democratic in that way, but vicious at times, right? In terms of what things were going to be there. So I love this because there is no other photo of the seating, right? And those are just slapped. Yeah, they used to talk about how they cut into your back. You're right. I have no problem believing that at all. And then what we don't see is it actually raises up here. And they had nothing below, so your feet kind of dangled. You could get up in there. There was just enough to walk in, and then stuff, you know, people would drop things. So the biggest fiasco after each performance was getting back people's stuff that they dropped at the end of it. Wild. They only had one source of heat right there. People talked about how cold it could be in there, especially if they didn't want to heat it up for rehearsals, right, to save money. It was as put together, as humanly possible in that sense, right? And that small little stage. Well, they opened their first bill in the Village November 3rd, 1916, presenting Floyd Dell's satire, King Arthur's Socks. And the reason they went with Dell, smart man George Cram Cook, is because he'd become famous for his satires at the Liberal Club. So they wanted everybody to know, we're part of you, we're a village group here, we're going to make fun of ourselves, which is what the comedy was in the beginning. Especially those early Provincetown plays up there. Louise Bryant's The Game, which I showed you, significant more for its sets significantly for its sets by the Zoraks, and then O'Neill's Bounties for Cardiff. The next bill featured more plays originally presented in Provincetown, including John Reed's Freedom and Cook and Glaspell's Suppressed Desires. The third bill featured a unique and experimental verse drama by poet and editor Alfred Cranberg. So if some of you know a little bit more about the avant-garde poetry in the Village, Cranberg was kind of a champion and in fact edited a magazine called Others. And he was part of the whole group that was with Glazy's, with Marcel Duchamp, the Annenberg group, all of those. We had everybody in this place, I'm telling you. And yet, Cranberg initially, people were really resistant because it was completely unusual, right? It was set to a tick-tock, right? It was like a metronome, and everything was done almost like musically, and it was a scherzo, so there was a beginning section and a middle section. You know, nobody knew what this was. They'd never seen anything like it. And I'll show you a picture, and that'll convince you even more in a moment. And in fact, everyone said no, and John Reed said, "I'll quit if you don't take this play." So he saved the experimental nature of the Players in the early days. Because everybody thought experimental just meant what the topics of the plays were, not also the formats of them, the structures and the way that they were presented in language. And as well as O'Neill's monologue play was also on that Before Breakfast. Though these new plays were fulfilling the experimental nature of their stated mission, the group almost folded by Christmas, because they ran out of quality new plays and found the interest waning of their larger membership in company decisions. They had a rule where everybody voted on every play that was submitted, and they had to be read at a group meeting. Right? Can you imagine? And people were just like, I can't do this anymore. Right? And so very quickly they changed. They punted and they changed and got an executive committee and then a reading committee. You know, and I mean, they didn't know. And so as people were waning and kind of dropping off on the sides, they kind of changed the way that they went at this, because they really tried to be as democratic as possible initially. The acting of the company was decidedly amateur, and they were somewhat saved in this by directorial leadership of Nina Moyes, and that's who is in the right there facing them, who had studied acting and who began to give shape and clarity to the staging of the plays after she joined them in the spring of 17. The first time she saw a rehearsal, people were just standing in front of each other. They had no idea. They weren't facing the audience. They weren't making their voices be heard. So everybody was so grateful when she showed up, right? And she had a friend that was involved in the group, and she had just left another company and a touring group and still had time. And actually came from a very famous industrial family in San Francisco, but she was the first major director for this group. This, along with the most good fortune any group could ever ask for. They didn't deserve this, but it happened, and it's why they survived the war and the pandemic that happened in 1918, everything else. The Stage Society of New York purchased almost half of the company, sight unseen, not knowing who they were. John Reed kind of made the case to them, knew them, they trusted him. And so they purchased almost half of the company's available subscriptions, allowing them to prosper in their first year. Reed soon deferred his leadership role when he needed serious kidney surgery and had journalistic responsibilities. And Cook became the main leader of the Players. Early arguments in the new company, of course there would be. There were 70 people making all the decisions initially, centered on whether to allow critics to attend, because they wanted to be decidedly amateur, right? Whether to seek publicity for these productions and their actors, and the constant tension between Cook and the younger members about the importance of the group remaining amateur, in other words, not being paid, to fulfill its mission. Cook's greatest asset was his ability to inspire and move the group forward with the strength of his personality, keeping them focused on their original goals. By 1919, however, most of the original group that had set those goals were aging, and they were no longer participants. Many having moved more deeply into the producing of their own individual work, and others literally having physically moved away from the village, some to Provincetown permanently. In those first 2 years, O'Neill had 6 new plays presented, Glasspool had 4 produced, Edna St. Vincent Millay, fresh from Vassar, and with notoriety as an emerging playwright, auditioned as the actor for the company and was cast. A few years later, her role would change to promising young playwright after her anti-war allegory, Aria da Capo, was produced. More about that in a moment. The Provincetown first full-length play was given in April 1918, The Athenian Women by George Cram Cook, and in the audience on opening night was anarchist and political activist Emma Goldman, a frequent visitor to the Players, whose niece and nephew-in-law were involved in the company. E.J. Ballantyne, a very famous actor at the time, was her nephew-in-law. Goldman brought with her that evening her friend and colleague Mary Eleanor Fitzgerald, who eventually became the business manager of the Provincetown and one of the company's first paid employees, who remained at the helm throughout the life of the Players. She was known as Fitzy. She's my favorite person in all my book, and I want to do a movie just about her life. You can imagine working for Goldman. Her apartment was raided constantly. She was there at all of these trials. She was the lover of Alexander Berkman, right? And she was there at the trial, and even the New York Times reporter from the trial talks about the pathos and her trying to say goodbye. And then Berkman was sent to one part of the country, and Goldman was sent to another, and she tried to keep it going, but she needed work, so the Players, she said, I can only work for you part-time. And then a year later, of course, and some of you may not know this, Edgar J. Hoover was a 24-year-old FBI agent who is the one who deported Goldman at close to Christmas morning in 1919, and Berkman and she went, and Fitzy tried to go as his common law wife and was not allowed to. So you can imagine her listening to actors complaining after the life she's experienced, with these anarchists and what she had lived through. In time and time after again. She and Berkman, their lives in San Francisco, the same. They're just constantly being dogged, and for all of that. So fascinating, and I adore her. Let's show a couple more pictures, and then we'll move to that. There's lima beans. If your eyes weren't in trouble before the play started, that's really geometric, and this is. You can barely see him because this is a blow up of all I have is a newspaper photo, right? But that is William Zorak back there, and it's about this young couple. And she decides that instead of lima beans, which he likes, one night she's going to offer him broccoli instead. And he hates it, Well, of course, it's a metaphor. You can choose which metaphor. And he doesn't like it. This guy's the vegetable guy, right? So he's, oh no, he'll love broccoli. It'll be fabulous. And then he doesn't. And so then they go back, the scherzo in the middle, when she tries the thing he doesn't like, and the last movement of it is that they go back to lima beans. Just like you do, you know? Let's see what else. Here again, look at the layers of the artwork. Unbelievable. This is Pan. George Cram Cook painted himself green. I can't say, there's no accounting for tastes, okay? But he played Pan, learned how to play the pan flutes, so he could do this play. But there it is in all its glory. Let's look at another one here. Well, how about back one? I'll tell that story really fast. Some of you probably know it. Let's see if it'll go to the left side. If it won't, it won't. Yes. Any of you know about arch conspirators? A few of you do. Okay, fabulous. Well, I could do an hour just on this, but I just wanted to at least show it to you. Some, because this is at the top of Washington Square Arch. Okay? And there's the Provincetown Playhouse right there. And even in there, and John Sloan is one of the characters, but he drew it later. And there was a night in January of 1917 when two of John Sloan's art students decided that they, in response to President Wilson's talking about small, any place small needs to have its own freedom. And he had given this major speech to the Senate that day. And Wilson was slowly, as it was getting clear he was going to enter America into the war after he won the election, on saying, no, not going to put you in the war, right? And yet it was clear he was about to. And so in protest, they went up, they had surveyed when the cops would come around, right? Police officers, and this one student had realized that the door was unlocked to go up to the top. So they got a bunch of food, and they got little hot pot kind of things that they could light to keep warm, because it was the end of January. And they went up there and they declared Greenwich Village independent from the rest of the United States. And they had a formal ceremony, and they have the balloons and the whole thing. This is Marcel Duchamp, who was part of the group. And quite the interesting kind of a thing. And I love it because this was the village, wasn't it? This was the village during that time. Then this is O'Neill's The Long Voyage Home. So you see the kind of crude painting, and nonetheless it got the point across, right? This is in a bar. Let's look at another. We'll go through these pretty quick. There is the Athenian women. That's the first. Somehow they got 33 people on that tiny little stage. They had stairs that would go down. And this is what she was able to do with this little place, just having a little bit of knowledge about theater. So I think there's another one, yes, of the theme. So there they are. Ida Rao, George Cram Cook. Let's go to the next one. This is the last play that they did in 139 McDougal Street. This is Women's Honor. This is a stage photo. These folks were never on stage all at one time. It was written by Glassful here. This is Ida Rao. And it was all about a man who was being accused of murder, but he had an alibi. But the alibi was he was spending the night with a married woman. And he wanted to keep her honor. And he didn't want to ask her to testify, and yet he was going to be convicted of murder. And so all these women come forward with their own stories about where they were with him. Of course, there can't be 9 stories, right? And so in the end, in Glassful's comedic way, he finally says, oh, I'm just going to admit to it. Because he just couldn't believe these stories, people he'd never seen before, that were trying to rescue him for his bravery and his heroism of not telling who he was really with that could exonerate him from this murder. So let's go on. At the end of the Provincetown's second New York season, subscriptions were up to $6.35, and the company felt they needed a larger space to operate in. Just 3 doors down from McDougal Street, owned by their same landlord, Miss Jenny Bellardi, she owned that, by the way, until 1940, when the bank finally took it away from her. But she hung in there all that time. Was an old stable that had been recently used as a wine bottling plant. The Players rented it for $400 a month. putting a scenery shop, let's go ahead and go to the, oh, you're there, never mind. Scenery shop and dressing rooms in what became a basement and office upstairs. Benches that could seat up to 200 were installed, and facing a reel in their minds, stage that they built to remind themselves that the space was once a stable. A hitching post was left hanging from one of the walls, and the inscription, "Here Pegasus was hitched," was painted above it. A plaster dome cyclorama, a pet project of Cook's and fashioned after those used in European art theaters of the time. It was literally a dome that was a half circle, and if no matter where you put light on it, because you had done sand on it in exactly the right way, it looked as if it just went on forever behind it. Unbelievable. And the sky, if you did blue on it, and those kinds of things. And people loved it, and it was used particularly for O'Neill's Emperor Jones in 1920. This is the theater at 133 McDougal Street, though many times since refurbished. In fact, completely demolished and rebuilt in 2010. That is known today as the Provincetown Playhouse. The first performance in the new theater took place on November 22nd, 1918, just 11 days after the armistice of the World War I was declared, with a bill of one-act plays by Millais, O'Neill, and Florence Kipper Frank. The second bill of the season featured O'Neill's mood play, the lyrical The Moon of the Caribbees. And let's go ahead, I think I have that there. But there you can see that was about 2 years in. They'd done a little better with some. They'd actually put cushions on the benches there. They more looked like pews to me in a church, right? But that was how they were described. And then, now I want to believe, when I found this while they were tearing the place apart in 1997, that is the hitch, where here Pegasus, I took a picture and I said, I'm going to tell everyone that's it, whether it is or not, right? But I don't know why in the middle of the theater they would have that. So I'm just going to be right about that, okay? And let's go one more. I think this is Moon of the Caribbees, yes. So there is the mood play, in the sense that there wasn't a strong plot. O'Neill experimented. That's what he did with the Provincetown Players. He wanted to see what would happen if. And one of those things was less of a plot and more of a mood. And he achieved it. And in fact, much like the drums of the Emperor Jones many years later that begin at the beginning of the play and end at the end of the play, right? And continue all the way through. In the same way, there were three women, the Millais sisters, who sang a song that began at the beginning of the play and didn't end until the end of the play. And so, again, he was experimenting with some expressionistic devices, and particularly when it comes to mood. The second was this, and then when in 1919 the tensions between the young and the old guard of the company reached an all-time high, Cook decided to take a year sabbatical as their leader, abdicating to James Light, a young director whose strong personality clashed with Cook's. Cook left with the assurance that Ida Rao, perhaps the company's most revered actress, was co-director with Light, and she would look to his priorities. Rao directed O'Neill's The Dreamy Kid, I don't know if you've heard of that play, in which she made the company the second in New York to cast all black actors in a play. This is before Emperor Jones, produced by a white theater company. But soon, she abdicated to Light's need to control and left the co-directorship. The most significant play that season was Millais' Aria da Capo, called by New York Times critic Alexander Wolcott the most beautiful and most interesting play in the English language, now to be seen in New York. Not a bad review. Cook returned to the helm, I'm almost done. Cook returned to the helm for the season of 1920-1921, which quickly became significant for the production of O'Neill's The Emperor Jones, the first of the Provincetown plays to be a bona fide hit with critics and audiences alike, and eventually the production moved uptown to the Princess Theater. Before the move, however, the Provincetown was flooded with ticket requests, bringing the number of subscribers to over 1,600. With how many seats? 200. So, right? However, the mostly amateur group with the highest of ideals for American playwrights was challenged with the perils of success. New plays soon were often selected for their potential to transfer to professional theaters, and this caused ideological clashes amongst the company. These differences of opinion deepened, and a contentious rehearsal period of O'Neill's The Hairy Ape took place during the 1921 and 22 season. This time, at this point, O'Neill was perhaps the most successful playwright in America, having won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for 2 plays not performed by the Provincetown Players, with the company performing his more experimental works. With The Hairy Ape, O'Neill feared premiering it on Broadway without trying it first on the Provincetown. But he surrounded the production at the Provincetown with Broadway professionals. And though Cook was originally assigned to direct, as he had The Emperor Jones, he was relieved of his duties, I'll put that in quotes, during the rehearsal period. This was a breach in every way of how the Players had always worked. This was just not what they did, right? They worked together in a very different way. Cook also realized that in that moment, that he had no playwrights of the quality of O'Neill or Glaspell to develop that justified the Players continuing in their mission. After their 6th New York season in 1922, a 1-year period of inactivity was called for by the members, and the Playhouse was rented by a group led by playwright agent Alice Kauser. Oh, what a fabulous history that 1 year was. Cook and Glaspell left even before that season was finished to live in Greece, where less than 2 years later, Cook died and is buried in Delphi. So let's look at the rest of these, and then I'll do my last paragraph here. So there's Bernice with Ida Rao and Susan Glaspell, another play famous for the main character, Bernice never being seen. She's dead in the next room. Yeah. Let's do another one here. There is rehearsals for Aria da Capo. You see the Edward Craig-inspired panels that they would move around to tell you where they were. And the next one's my favorite. This is the crew. Everybody's having a sing, and with lead paint, so it could just blow up. And they're painting everything. I just love this. That's how it works backstage, right? Let's keep going. There's Charles Gilpin as Brutus Jones in The Emperor Jones. Such amazing story about how he was honored and how O'Neill went to his defense when hotels wouldn't even allow them to have the awards or him to enter when he was going to be given one of the top 10 awards in theater that year because he was black. Let's keep going. There's another one of him. There's so many wonderful photos from that production. Let's keep going. There you can see how they did the layering, and then this is the dome back there. That's just creating kind of a luminescence, right? And it gave depth in an amazing way. Let's keep going. There is that same scene with the witch doctor, and as you may know, the Emperor Jones goes backwards in time, where this man takes over this West Indian community that believes him being an emperor because he says he can only be killed by a silver bullet, right? And yet, eventually he knew they were going to catch on to him, right? He'd taken a lot of their money and all that. But as he thinks he's planned a way off the island, they trick him. And he just turns out, and while he's doing it, he's basically having quite the psychological experience of going backwards in time as an African American. And in fact, at one point is a slave on a block, right? And then he's in the Middle Passage in a boat. And then he's with a witch doctor in Africa. And as he's doing it, his soldier costume, which he wore as the emperor, right, is slowly being ripped off so that he's only in a loincloth by the time he finishes the play. And then we hear the silver bullet. And that's the end of Brutus Jones. Let's keep going. There he is. Just amazing acting, they say. Like, as much as O'Neill would get, he didn't like the pejorative words that O'Neill had written for him to say about African Americans, so he would not say them. And so O'Neill finally fired him. But he was also an alcoholic, and so that complicated things, in terms of that. But always later, O'Neill said Gilpin was the greatest actor of any play he had ever written. Keep going here. There is Susan Glaspell's The Verge, another really unusual psychological and expressionistic play. They did some amazing things with that. It's doing its thing. We'll do one more. I'll read this while it's coming back. You can do one more. I think that's where I am. Oh, here's The Hairy Ape. Again, you see this really, truly amazing. And it did transfer to Broadway. But Cook and Glaspell were already on the boat to Greece. Nobody knew that they had met with the executive committee and ended the Players. They didn't tell them until the season was over, but Cook and Glaspell were like, we're done. I'm done. O'Neill has won, if you will. And O'Neill regretted it. many years later. And in fact, there's an amazing letter that he wrote to Glasspool apologizing, and they were going to put a plaque. They did for a time in the Playhouse. There's one more, I think, of the Harry. Amazing play. One more then. There we are. By 1922, under Jig Cook's leadership, the Provincetown Players could boast of having produced 93 new American plays by 47 playwrights. The Emperor Jones featured the critically praised African-American actor Charles Gilpin, and James Weldon Johnson, the head of the NAACP at the time, claimed that the Players were the initial and greatest force in opening up the way for African-Americans on the dramatic stage. A remarkable feature of this group was the unusually large quantity and quality of participation of women for its time, particularly both in artistic and management functions. In their 6 short years in New York, they had presented the first truly experimental American plays, expressionistic, futuristic, and surrealistic, plays with potent political themes, poetic and verse plays, allegory plays, plays that showed the plight of lower and middle class Americans and immigrants. When you look at even a partial list of those who significantly interacted with the Players, you realize you are considering an elite who's who of writers, artists, and theater practitioners of the early 20th century. These include Mary Heaton Vorse, Hutchins Hapgood, Neath Boyce, Wilbur Daniel Steele, Robert Edmund Jones, Max Eastman, Ida Rao, Floyd Dell, Emma Goldman, James Light, John Dewey, the educator, Otto Kahn, Edna St. Vincent Millay, B.J.O. Nordfeld, Charles DeMuth, William and Marguerite Zorak, Harry Kemp, John Reed, Louise Bryant, Juna Barnes, Maxwell Bodenheim, Mary Caroline Davies, Edna Ferber, Alfred Cranberg, Lawrence Langner, David Pinsky, Evelyn Scott, Wallace Stevens, Lawrence Vail, Rita Wellman, Bernice Abbott, Sophie Treadwell, Thomas Mitchell. He was Brother Billy in It's a Wonderful Life, and he was also Doc Holliday in Stagecoach, and he was one of their directors for a time. Jacques Coupeau. Charlie Chaplin wanted to be in The Emperor Jones badly, and everybody said no. If word gets out that you're in it, they'll know. And so they refused to let him do it, but he wanted to do it. Theodore Dreiser, Mike Gold, Anne Harding, and even a young Claudette Colbert. So, the Provincetown Players, of course, significantly launched the careers of O'Neill and Glasspool, both of whom will win numerous awards, including Pulitzer Prizes for drama. Glasspool presented subtle yet powerfully complex women as lead characters, and without a thumping pulpit approach, became important as a feminist playwright, bridging the Victorian era with the modern. O'Neill, of course, went on to experiment with ways he could communicate the depths of feeling in his characters. He felt that language just was insufficient. And he has voluminous stage directions, most of the time trying to tell actors what they're supposed to be thinking and feeling. Because subtext was a Stanislavski thing that really hadn't taken hold yet in actors in America. That comes in the 30s with the group theater, right? And so but he knew what he wanted. He just could never get it. He was really always disappointed with the acting. And eventually said, I just want my plays to be read. Of course, plays were never written to be read, right? They were made to be seen. Explore complex themes of human struggle, and ultimately, here's what he did. He used the people in his own life to write plays that became the first true American tragedies that still resonate with audiences today, like Long Day's Journey, The Iceman Coming, Moon for the Misbegotten, so many of those. In short, the Provincetown Players launched American playwriting into the modern era and made a pathway for serious American playwrights to create artistic plays about serious issues. In the words of theater critic William Archer, it's in this hallowed ground in the region of Washington Square that we must look for the real birthplace of American drama. All they are in the fronts of the Provincetown through the years. Maybe some of you, there's 1927, another in 36. It really evolves. Bernice Abbott's famous photo, there's 1950s. That's a difference, right? But that's where they got the current, right, design from. Let's see another one. That one's a weird one, but it was there for the 50s. There's a playhouse in 1996. That was the first time I saw it. It had that. Kind of a, and it was closed, by the way. After Vampire Lesbians of Sodom, the bathrooms were downstairs and they had no elevator. So the city just padlocked it. They hadn't noticed for years. And so when the biggest thing, the biggest expense for us in 1997 for NYU was the elevator that you had to be able to go down to the bathrooms. You had to have that. So let's see, I think we're almost there. There's a difference during that same time, 97. There's when it was refurbished, right, in 98, although that's taken in 2009. And then here is what it currently looks like. And there's nothing in it that's original or the same. If you've been in it, it's so sad. But I'm so happy the years I was there, really, it was only a refurb. It wasn't, but once they started, that's the next book, I won't start. But once they started working on it, of course the walls were from 1840. And everything just fell apart. And they just didn't count things right to get it done. And so as much as they tried to save things, all they saved was some of the brick here in the front. That's it, right? I know, I agree with you. And thankfully I was at ASU and I couldn't chain myself to the front of the play, because I'd be in prison now and this book would never have gotten written, so. I'm open to your questions if you have any. Yes, ma'am?
That was fantastic.
Oh, thank
you so much.
Oh, thank you.
You learned so much.
Oh, good. And I have no passion about this at all, so.
Really, thank you. Images and all of it. But here's my question. You said that Cram Cook wanted to have new plays in the modern style.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what was that modern style to him? Because when I think back on it, we know what Eugene O'Neill did. We know what, and you showed us some, but I'm just wondering what was considered the modern style before O'Neill?
Well, first of all, it didn't sound British in any way, shape, or form in its verbiage. So modern, and interestingly, Cook and Glaspell and Floyd Dell all were from Davenport, Iowa. So when you think Midwest accent, of course we think they have one here in New York, right, dialect if you will, the syntax literally was what Sherwood Anderson, Theodore Dreiser, others were beginning to use in their novels. And that was the language. And the modern language, there's a way to tell it not easy. For me, the most compressed way to say it is that it's more realistic than the end of the Romantic era. And so Cook had written some romantic novels, as had Glaspell. They were kind of in the between part. But what Cook did when he was at the Chicago Literary Times was to really encourage this new kind of writing. And so he knew what that sounded like. And I promise you, there's plenty of bad plays that sound like it. And they played them, they did them. But they were trying to change, right, and also just completely remove, weirdly, the same as the Irish, themselves from the British idea of verbiage, of Shakespeare, of all of that, to find an American sound. And of course, group theater, everybody from that point on, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and everyone, Thornton Wilder, they all benefit from this because nobody knew what that was like yet.
But also, wasn't it not only absolutely the syntax and the way the language was presented, but also we were moving away from the music hall sort of spectacles, and they wanted to get down to, like you said, the little theater movement.
Yeah.
They wanted to get down to, it wasn't yet kitchen sink drama, but was realistic American
Absolutely.
themes
lower classes, middle classes in a way that had really never been celebrated.
In John Sloan and those at the Ashcan School.
That's why they were there, absolutely. And why the masses, they were all interchangeable as they were trying, in a sense, to be revolutionary for the middle and lower classes at the time.
I found it really interesting that you said that they squashed, or it's been squashed, that's not the right word, but they tried to stay away from the more experimental forms
Initially,
for a
yeah.
while.
Yeah.
Because, it was like maybe those who wanted to do that were just getting a little bit ahead of themselves. They hadn't gotten
Oh, yes.
to the core of what they needed to do.
Well, and we're interesting in America. We call things that were written in 1911 because they have dissonance and, we look at Gertrude Stein still as avant-garde. Well, how can anything 110 years be avant-garde? So that's the wrong term for it, right? It's just experimental in a way. We are very Aristotelian whether we like it or not. Right? As we watch exposition, rising action, conflict, crisis resolution. Every television show, some movies move those things around, but it's still Aristotle, right? And so they weren't ready to go there because they had never seen anything like that. And the only place they'd seen it was in poetry, which is why they tried really hard to let poets like Wallace Stevens and and they just didn't know how to do them. And they didn't believe in them enough. They tried. Now, all of Cranberg's friends showed up. Here is Marcel Duchamp. Here's Glazes. Here's all of these amazing artists that were part of the Annenberg group. They all came and they screamed in approval at the end of that. So then they didn't really know what to do, right? And so they let it go on for a while. But just further and further they went with the poetic plays, which was the only place I see. I've read every play, and the only place I see where they really tried that experiment of structure change, of language change. And guess what? Poetry was never intended to be spoken in the way that theater necessarily needs connection, right, to human experience. It's been done successfully at times. But that's not what poetry is designed for. That's why O'Neill could never write novels. He wanted to write novels. He was terrible at it. He just knew how to write dialogue. And then he was like, yeah, but I'm not feeling what they're supposed to be feeling, right? They're not giving me that. And so he was completely frustrated. And it takes until all those characters up there in Long Days and Iceman were his friends and family. And then he knew what they were feeling and found a way, finally, at the end, to communicate. Well, that's a pretty good end. Most playwrights at the end, it's, right? He went the other direction. And Long Days, of course, he never intended it for anyone to see. It was just supposed to be read, never supposed to be performed. And his widow, Carlotta, felt that he was going down in the public mind, and so she let a group in Stockholm perform it, and then Ted Mann decided he wanted to perform it in 1956, and it was finally done, and of course overnight, it was supposedly the greatest play written by an American. So, and we still celebrate it in a huge way. So, yes?
Would you just talk a little more about the conflict between George Cram Cook and Susan Glassbell and O'Neill in terms of was it that he was just getting too big and he started moving uptown and they didn't want that, they wanted more amateur, what was the
That's so interesting. I just published an article on Glassbell and O'Neill.
Okay.
Because that question has been there. And in fact, they were very, very close in the early days when they both lived in Provincetown and George wasn't even there. And O'Neill would write all morning and she would write all morning and then he'd go to her house. And in fact, his young wife was starting to be jealous. Right, she was 12 years older than him and there was nothing like that between, but they if anybody, oh my God, if we could just know what they talked about. Because this went on for almost a year, right? And so it wasn't about that, but there was a point at which Cook, who could be a highfalutin talker, no getting around it, there's lots of evidence of that, but he was also an inspirer. Well, O'Neill was not, this is not who you want as your best friend to talk over your life's problems, right? O'Neill was not that kind of a friend, right? If his wife would say, Agnes would say that he would read a book most of the time when other people were in the room, right? So but he and Cook were extremely close. But yes, once he got the success to use, plus O'Neill backed James Light in 1919. And that really didn't sit well with George. But here's another little, again, I can't start some subjects, right? Because I'll have to tell you everything. But O'Neill, or Cook for a time, you're going to hate him for a minute, had an affair with Ida Rao. And a lot of people were really upset. So his wife was really happy to grab him from New York for a year. And in fact, that supposedly, that never happened, continued, right, after that. The irony was she'd had her husband do exactly the same thing, Rao. So O'Neill was not involved in the Daily. He was home writing, and they were just happy to get his plays. But if you can have 2 Pulitzer Prize winning plays on Broadway that the Players didn't do, your career has taken a different trajectory. And so for a while, they were thrilled about that. And in fact, they tried to keep Broadway productions and the Provincetown productions going all at the same time. And they were running out of actors. They were, hiring people they didn't know, to do these things. Emperor Jones was not a small cast, right? And they had to make 14 costume changes, that kind of thing. So what I can say is, all we know is that the 2 of them used to argue, and again, I have no dialogue of those arguments, but it was because it was arguments of friends. They were philosophically in the same place. Max Stirner, O'Neill walked around with also Zarathustra in his pocket his whole life, and Nietzsche, and so, and the 2 of them were philosophers at their heart. So they were as close as could be, but that breach, right, especially after Cook made Emperor Jones as a director. And then and some of the problem was George just assumed he would direct Harry Ape, and O'Neill didn't have the heart. He never could tell anybody no, even though he'd already told everybody else he wasn't going to let him do it. So then, at the very end, James Light, who's been away from the company in Europe as an agent for O'Neill plays in Europe, I just found that out recently. He comes back in the middle of this conflict, and O'Neill has Light supervise George's arch enemy, as far as he's concerned. So that's kind of what happened, as best I can say it. But you should read what he writes about Cook after he died. It's very clear the guilt that O'Neill felt, and because he realizes they gave him his entire opportunity. And so that's what's sad about that happening. But it wasn't like George was actively involved towards the end in a dispute, right? And then they incorporated, used the names Provincetown Players, and then Susan and Jake 2 days later were on a boat to Greece, where they had always wanted to go. So, yes, ma'am.
During the summers, did they go back up to Provincetown?
Shockingly, no. After 1916, they never did another production up there. Now, they had friends who did, but everybody used it as the time to write. Jig and Susan have a house. It's still there, across the street from where the Playhouse was and where the wharf was. And so they lived there pretty much. And then when Jig died in 1920, January of 24 in Greece, and he's buried there in Delphi, Susan came back to that house, and at one point she was even in charge of the Midwest Writers Division of the Federal Theater Project and Writers Project. So, she didn't stop. She won the Pulitzer in 1931 for her play Allison's House. So she continued for a while. And then, she just never got over George. She married someone else, and then it turned out he was kind of using her, and she started to drink, and wasn't fun. So no, but they were all there. That's what's crazy. They were there, but they weren't doing plays. Yes, ma'am.
Well, a year after this ended, the St. Vincent play had another group, I think, founded the Cherry Lake.
Yep.
So.
Well, and I need you to know, who did I write this for? She actually didn't. And I'll send you that article.
I'd like that too.
Okay. There's a really good reason you would say she did, and they have tried to connect her to all of that forever. And she just lived down the street is all. And I actually, the head of, this is how I made nice with the Malay folks for my cover. She wanted me to research it, and I discovered pretty quickly that she was never part of Cherry Lane. Now, she was part of other thing called the Tryout Theater and different things. So you're not wrong that she wasn't involved in theater, but then she became the rock star of all time with poetry. Her poetry readings had thousands and thousands of young people at colleges, at auditoriums, and if you listen to her speak, she's aping Ida Rao's voice. I have recordings of Ida Rao, and Malay didn't talk like this. But when she reads her poetry, my candle burns at both ends.
Wasn't Ida Rao known as the Dooza of the village?
And she was the Dooza of McDougal Street. Yes, ma'am.
Somebody told me that Betty Davis had her first chance.
She did, and it was in the second part of this in 28, 29, yeah. She was part of the Experimental Theater Company, which takes over in 1924.
Oh.
And O'Neill was part of that group, and then that only lasts 3 years. And then James Light comes in, and Fitzy's still in charge, and they continue until 1929, until the stock market crash.
Really?
And she was in a play called The Earth Between, and it's a play about incest. It's pretty intense. And she was an 18-year-old actress, and it was her first major stage piece, yeah.
So next door at 135 McDougal
Yes.
was also the Heterodoxy Club.
Yes. Well, that's where, it was also the Liberal Club, so that's where they met.
Okay.
It was the Liberal Club and Heterodoxy met there.
Inside.
And they'd love to meet at Polly's downstairs, too.
Right. So the intersection of the political, the feminist, and
Absolutely.
these women who were a part of this incredible group.
This could not have happened anywhere but the village.
Yeah.
It could not have
That
happened
mixture
anywhere.
is just very...
And the content of these plays. I mean, to have 17 women as playwrights and managers, that was unheard of in the teens and 20s, please,
They
right?
didn't have the right to vote.
Well, that's right. And in fact, many of them, Rao being the number one,
Yeah.
were activists, major activists for all of that. Yes, ma'am?
Was there any backlash at the time of like putting plays written by women on stage, or even putting a black man on the stage, and what did people say about it?
You know the critics, one of the most interesting thing is Glaspell's last play, The Verge, where you saw that interesting expressionistic stage. That was where the critics parted ways with her. Because you know what she did? She took Nietzsche's Superman and made her a woman.
Shame.
Of course.
And they didn't get it. Wolcott went twice and wrote twice. I mean, you could see he's trying. He couldn't get it, right? And yet there's only 2 women reviewers, one for the Brooklyn Eagle at the time, and she completely gets it and says it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life, right? But and so that had a lot to do. You know, she wrote another amazing play called Inheritors that was all about standing up for political belief in the midst of all of those bad laws that we still have in the books today, the Espionage Act and all of that for protesters that people pull out at the weirdest times, like 2 years ago, they tried, right? And so she wrote this play. It's got the most poignant scene you've ever seen in your life. She's fearing, her main character's fearing going to prison herself, and so she draws on the ground how big the cell is that's been reported, and she stands in it. I mean, come on, for an audience, that just, you know. And so that's why glass was being discovered again in an interesting way. In the 70s and particularly 80s, I'm on the International Susan Glaspell Society board, and you know, we continue to discover more about it. Because she continued writing short stories, novels, all of those things. Yeah. No. The answer is, sorry, I didn't quite answer your question. You know, the critics would say things, but nobody knows. And they were private, always. They were a subscription-based thing. You couldn't just go buy a ticket at the door, right? You couldn't do it. No judge would convict anybody. They tried. Police arrested people for going on Sundays and all kinds of days and all these different things. No one was ever convicted because they knew, no, this is subscription, this is private, right? There were problems over content, and in fact, in the 20s, in the next group, All God's Children Got Wings, there was a single scene in which Paul Robeson kisses the hand of Mary Blair, a white woman, and they were shut down by the mayor. Well, they couldn't quite shut it down, so what they did was they removed the two children that were these two characters as children, which was important to O'Neill's play because it showed they already had a relationship. And then they marry, older. And it didn't even matter that they married, it mattered that he kissed her hand. 1924. And so what they would do is the stage manager, Harold McGillan, would come out and read the first scene. And then they would continue the play. And that was the way they did it. Yeah, yes?
I wondered if you could talk more about the end of the theater and Cook's move, symbolically significant, it seemed to me, from what you had said earlier, to Delphi and his death there.
I just happen to have one more photo. I think it's right after this. Please, God. There it is. One of the fun things is the O'Neill Society is going to Greece next year. And I'm going to lead them on behalf of the Glassbellians up to Delphi, where I've spent a week, and where he is buried, and where he is the only human ever granted a stone from the Temple of Apollo as his gravestone. He made that much of an impression as an inspirer. He knew how to be Greek more than the Greeks in his mind. And so the literary folks there fell madly in love with him and went to the government and got this stone. He started after Ava, another long story I can't tell you, Ava Palmer Siklianos. She was an expat who married Greece's most famous poet. She came from a very rich, John Palmer, the senator, started the railroads in America, very rich American family. Ended up in Greece. She started making Greek costumes. Her weave and loom is still in her house at the top of the hill in Delphi, which we'll visit. And down the corridor from it, just down a little pathway, is George's grave. And he started dressing like a shepherd. Nobody else was, by the way, just so you know. This is how serious, but he was a Greekophile his whole life. His biggest disappointment when he was at Harvard, he was supposed to go to Greece, and his family, even though for a long time they were quite wealthy, didn't have the money to send him. And so he never got to Greece. So the story is that they were sitting with this O'Neill situation and Harry Abe. And one day, Susan didn't know where he was. She walked over to the Playhouse, and here he was with an empty stage playing with the lights on the dome, making these amazing things. And she sat down, and they were quiet for a long time. And finally, he turned to her and says, "It's time to go to Greece." And that was the decision. And everybody thinks it was only about him and O'Neill, and I do believe that that was part of it. But in the end, I'm convinced he had no one more to shepherd. He was the man who helped O'Neill. He was the man who helped Glassell. He gave him. In my book is this wonderful thing. Mike Gold, some of you know, was originally Erwin Greenwich, and then became the most popular, or the most notorious, if you will, communist writer of the 20s and 30s. His name is Michael Gold. Well, his birth name is Erwin Greenwich. And he wanted desperately to be part of the Provincetown Players. And there, somewhere, someday, again, thank Providence from University of Michigan, a librarian who knew I was looking at things, sends me his handwritten, badly and sometimes badly typed autobiography that never was published. And here he describes his first night with George Cram Cook and how he took him to the stage and turned on the lights and said, "Now this is what has to happen in a play. Now what kind of ideas do you have?" And this whole, you just saw, thank God, I didn't have anything other than just kind of a general thing, that Cook was that kind of a developer, right? But he was. And I just think he got to the end. They were searching for plays at the end and not finding. By that point, the village had radically changed. If you came to the village as a young person now, you were looking for fame now. You were looking for money now. And that's why most of the old guard left, right? Many just left either to other parts of the city or out of the city completely. And so, he was fighting against other, plus he was in his 50s by that time, right? So that was the other thing. That group in Provincetown, those really smart, wonderful writers that were all deep, deep friends, they were that transition group between the Victorian and the new. And O'Neill really wasn't that, even though he understood the Victorian because of his father, but he was very young as well. So, I just think it came to that. And, and who knew? George, he wasn't that old when he died. And he died of glanders from his puppy. If you can believe it, something that rarely ever goes from an animal to a human. But they were in Delphi and they couldn't get doctors from Athens up because there was a snowstorm on Mount Parnassus. And so he died on January 11th of 1924. So, but in the meantime, he had become beloved, and it started, of course, the Delphi Players, right? And the shepherds who were going to tell their stories. I mean, that's who he was. He couldn't stop himself. Plus, he learned to speak modern Greek and write it while he was there in just 2.5 years. So he was a force to be reckoned with. There's no getting around. And there can only be so many forces in a group. This is why there were, I just wish I had one rehearsal period to have listened to what went on. Harry Kemp one day walked in the middle of while he was telling, I think it was Mine Gold, about his play, and it was, Down the Air Shaft. And he was telling him, and he's being idealistic, and Harry Kemp was, that's bullshit. That's crazy. This doesn't, no, and Emma Goldman wouldn't even put up with this crap, George. And so they're going, well, I just have to believe it was always like that. But the breach was in the friendship ultimately with O'Neill, and when O'Neill did something, and he knew he'd done it, but he didn't stop it. And he had producers and money and his life and all the awards and everything going on at the same time. But he regretted it very quickly. And then George left, and then he died. He never saw him again or spoke to him. So.
Professor Kennedy, thank you so very much.